He's such a distinguished and active scholar that I'm reading here from the summary of the summary of the summary of his CV. You see? And yet it's so long, so you can tell, and this is
because I'm old.
a perfect example of the kind of universities professor who is very active in his discipline and is well known around the world. So as a social and cultural historian, working primarily in the 20th century in the United States context, she has published extensively in several areas. The oldest and continuing field of scholarship is utopian studies. I don't know as a utopian scholar. His 1997 book, Utopianism and Radicalism in the Reforming America, 1888 through 1918, remains a significant interdisciplinary contribution to this field. And in this field also he has other publications, including Transforming Utopia and an article in the Humanities Center collection titled Remapping the Humanities. His 2004 article, Utopian Aspirations in the Black Freedom Movement, in the journal Utopian Studies, won an award for the best journal article of that year. An overlapping interest is in Black freedom movement, and particularly the role of students and white activists in that movement. And that has resulted in the 2009, a chapter in the 2009 ABC CLIO Readers Civil Rights Movement, People and Perspectives, and the forthcoming book from the University of Michigan Press, entitled Shall We Overcome? White and Black Freedom Movement and the Struggle for Radical Justice. But another recent area of scholarly investigation has been in the history of the U.S. imperialism and its global and domestic proportions, especially in the post-war World War II period. As I read. The publications include his 2009 published press book entitled Dying Empire, U.S. Imperialism and Global Resistance. And also has an entry entitled The American Century in the 2009 Sharp Encyclopedia of the Culture Wars, and the 2010 article in the Journal of Critical Globalism. Finally, an ongoing interest is in the connection between labor and gender issues in a comparative context, with a particular focus on early 20th century syndicalism and the industrial workers of the world. And this has resulted in publications in the Australian Journal, Labor History, the Swedish Journal, other historian, the Canadian Journal, Left History, and two United States journals, International Labor and Working Class History and Radical History Review. Over the last decade, he has also published scores of political, cultural, and historical commentaries on websites such as Common Dream, Counterpunch, History News Network, Public Resistance, State of Nature, Swan's Commentary, and Zenith. Many of these have been republished on numerous websites around the world and translated into Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, Farsi, Dutch, and other languages. So he's a veteran activist in peace, justice, and international solidarity campaigns. He's a long-time member of the Michigan Coalition for Human Rights. And I even summarized this summary of the summary of the summary of his CV. So you are in the presence of a distinguished, very busy, very productive scholar and teacher. So please, welcome to the podium with enthusiastic applause, Professor Frank Shor, who's going to talk to you today on declining U.S. hegemony, rising Chinese power, a formula for conflict. Professor Shor.
Thank you. I was just thinking of Walter's wonderful introduction. It reminds me that it's as much a marker of my age as it is of my productivity. Probably more of my age than my productivity. In any case, thank you all for being here. I want to first of all thank Walter and the Humanities Center as a really wonderful resource that many of you know about on campus. And I want to thank Jennifer and Emily for their help in preparing today's presentation. The presentation really sort of picks up from where my book, A Dying Empire, leaves off, because it's one of those moments that's sort of equivalent to the aha moment. It's the, oh damn, I didn't include that moment. And you know, if you look in the index of the book and look at for China, there's very, very little about China, which leads me to my first caveat. I am not a scholar of China. I would defer to my colleague who's here, thank goodness, and other folks here from the Confucius Institute. But my primary interest is, in fact, what I will try to cover today, is very much under the scholarly work of people who find themselves working in the area known as world systems research. And that's historically people like Emmanuel Wallerstein and Giovanni Arrighi and Bev Silver and Chris Chase Dunn, folks who have a journal on world systems research. And primarily for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's essentially a way of trying to understand the rise and fall of empire, particularly from the 15th century on in terms of the Western world. And Giovanni Arrighi's newest book, the last book, because he's passed, was Adam Smith in Beijing, which tries to look at, again, the long trajectory of Chinese history and to reconfigure it in terms of the understanding of world systems research. So my concern as an American historian has been primarily trying to understand the rise and fall of U.S. Hegemony and the rise and fall of the U.S. empire. So what I want to do is to find I will try to look at a couple of markers in this trajectory. And one thing that world systems theory deals with is, of course, the decline of empires too. And there has been controversy, and it's not an uncontested position to argue that we are in this moment of decline. And I will be citing a number of indices that indicate where that decline is evident and where the Chinese rise is also evident. But I want to sort of go back in time with what is, for many historians, sort of some markers to look at the trajectory of the rise and fall of the U.S. empire. And this will sort of signal where it is that when I get to the last point, because my book really did focus more on the post-1970s era and the crisis of that particular moment. So if we can try to think about this as sort of overlapping temporal dimensions. There's the long 19th century and essentially internal colonialism. I've got a graphic that I'll talk about that relates specifically to that. And I'll use these graphics also to try to indicate where China is in terms of its trajectory. So we have the long 19th century and internal colonialism to 1890, and some people sort of forget the fact that the march westward was as much about creating an empire. So that part of what the argument is of not just my argument, but other scholars going back to the work of William Appleman Williams on U.S. empire, is that that moment of internal colonialism was very definitely part of that empire building, and that if you look how deeply rooted in the political culture empire is, then you have to begin to understand that we're really talking about almost an embedded DNA in the political culture. Secondly, we look at external colonialism, this period when the United States enters the world stage, and sometimes referred to in popular terms. And this is a period from basically the 1890s to the 1930s. I'll have another little graphic to look at that. And then what Mayer calls, and Charles Mayer calls, the empires of production and the empires of consumption. And this is that period from World War I through World War II, when the United States actually is contesting for who will supplant England, Great Britain, as the next empire. And there are some who suggest that the war, World War I and World War II, are actually moments when that contestation was sort of fought out between the United States and Germany about who would be the preeminent to emerge. And then there's the period of the Cold War and global hegemony, that period from 1947 to 1991. And as I said, these are overlapping because from the perspective of a world systems approach, there is a signal crisis in the 1970s as an accumulation of factors. The loss in Vietnam, of the war, the crisis in terms of going off the gold standard and revoking the Bretton Woods Agreement that emerged in 1944 to establish gold as a standard. It was, of course, the United States controlled 3/4 of the gold reserves, which was always a nice way of establishing your preeminence and having that kind of reserve. So, Cold War and that signal crisis is that moment which there is a need to reconfigure how the world stage, the economic, political, geopolitical forces will be played out. And then there is what many of the people in the world systems research, Oriki in particular, call the terminal decline. And this is another one of those over-layering and over-determined moments where you have the failures in Iraq and Afghanistan in terms of the wars going on. And in addition, the global capitalist crisis. And of course, Wallerstein, and I'm less certain about this than Wallerstein is. Wallerstein is predicting, we're at the end of the 500-year rule of capitalism. And this is the crisis we're going through, and it's not just, represented by the few people who are there and occupy Wall Street, but it's a larger crisis engulfing, the globe. And again, so we're in this kind of point of terminal decline. Okay, so as I said, I wanted to go back to review each of these steps as a way to give a little bit of background and then move forward. This is, some of you may know this is a wonderful painting by John Gass from the 1870s. And this is just, everything about this screams, the iconography of this screams, the creation of what Edward Said, in one of his critical moments about talking about American naivete, about its innocence and establishing its empire. And that wonderful figure of the woman in white captures that sensibility that I think that Said was talking about. So you get here is the March of Progress, right? She's holding the telegraph wires. We have these trains emerging. You have off to the left those barbaric forces, savage forces, which are being overtaken by the March of Progress. And there's all sorts of ways we can deconstruct this. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I think it is telling to know that part of the building of the infrastructure of empire was contingent upon the establishment of this extensive network of transportation and communication. And this was part of that 19th century expansion. And of course, not all of that was, much of that capital toward the end of the 19th century in railroad investment came from England, which was the center of capital investment in the globe. And it's interesting to note that, of course, the Chinese, and one of the ways in which they're surpassing the United States is the production of fast trains and maglev trains, although we've had little problems with them recently. Nonetheless, the Germans have been very helpful in establishing these routes that the Chinese are now pushing through. And in fact, I just saw something suggesting, believe it or not, that they're looking at not only a rail line that will go from Russia to China through North Korea and then into South Korea as part of also a pipeline that will continue of natural gas that will move through that area and reconfiguring some of the trade alliances. So what's happened is, in the 19th century, is the emergence of the American empire and its internal colonialist manifestation. You have the manifestations also of this kind of economic takeoff. And I think we've seen this over the last 20 or 30 years in China too. Again, my colleagues will know much more about China than I can talk a little bit about this. Okay, moving forward to the next step. After all, the Philippines are only the stepping stone to China. And of course, this was part of the argument when the United States went into the Philippines, created numerous, in terms of the strategy of defeating the forces of Aguinaldo, the nationalist Philippine leader. It was a horrific massacre of lots of innocent people. The first establishment of waterboarding, by the way, which was in the Philippines. But here it was all seen as in a number of ways. Because empire doesn't work just in one dimension. There was obviously a geopolitical dimension, and that geopolitical dimension was much about the United States wanting to be a two-ocean navy and establishing coaling stations that would allow it to get to Asia. And China was seen, as it is today, as the major market, right? Because this is like, here are the goods, the over production of materials that can then be traded to China through the so-called open door policy, which would attempt to establish U.S. hegemony without looking like it was colonialist, like the old European colonial powers. The United States began to view then the Pacific as sort of our Pacific. Right? Not only would we establish these coaling stations there, but this would be our Pacific. So we have, in our Pacific, we have 100,000 U.S. troops, some in 40,000 in Japan. The major naval area now is in Guam. And of course, one of the points of contestation that I want to highlight a little bit later is over the South China Sea. And this is potentially one of those places that could lead to something more than just mere naval exercises by China and the United States. That presumption that the United States not only is becoming a Pacific power, but somehow should have hegemony in the Pacific. This is that moment of the empire production. This is the moment of the arsenal of democracy. This is that great production during World War II. And in a sense, establishing the immediate backdrop to the emergence in the post-World War II period of what Eisenhower denounced in his 1961 farewell address as the unwarranted influence of the military-industrial complex. And we are still under that influence. And it's that influence and the forces that are part of that extensive military-industrial complex that is pushing forward an agenda that augurs some danger in the future in terms of the relationship with China. And of course, we're still the #1 producer of weapon systems in the world. This is still, we have our military budget is essentially equal to all the rest of the nations in the world, although China is now investing a lot more in its military budget and just got its first large naval aircraft carrier, although I guess it was a reconfigured one. So it doesn't have the 10 or 11 aircraft carriers that I think are in the U.S. Navy that dominate the seas. Now, here's from The Economist. So this is sort of the last moment that I'm going to leave us at. Here is China's view of the United States. It's like that old New Yorker cover of New York's view of the rest of the world. After the Tigers get through with them on Thursday in New York, it's even better that they'll defeat them at Yankee Stadium. Anyway, we can always hope. So I don't know if you this is wonderful. This is like, okay, so here's China, and then here's America with all sorts of cracks going on, and that's Wall Street, and that's foreclosure sale, and there's the mineral wealth of Latin America, and there's Prada in Europe, and here's more mineral and oil in Africa, and it's sort of the economist's take on how China may view the world. So those are sort of graphics that help to provide some graphic equivalent to those overlapping moments of the rise and fall of the U.S. empire. And that's, as I said, as a sort of background, a backdrop to it. Now, if I just want to turn these off, no, that's it. Okay. All right. So now blank screen. Now, sorry, no more graphics, but I hope to, no more pictures. I hope to keep your interest anyhow. So what I'm going to try to lay out now, having given that trajectory. So the premise, of course, is the United States is in empire decline. But these are the most dangerous moments also, often, of empire. And I would argue that it's particularly dangerous given the constellation of political and economic and military forces that are prevalent in the U.S. So that although it is always with a little trepidation that historians project into the future, I will try to do that based upon my reading of some of the contemporary signs. Most of all, to go back to the empire production, I think you all know that the IMF recently predicted that in 2016, China would be the #1 economy in the world. It's now number 2 behind the United States. Of course, China, as Alex and others will point out, is also a very fragile, in a very fragile state. I mean, they have an enormous free-floating proletariat. In a sense, there are hundreds of strikes at any particular moment. There is environmental devastation. Having said all of that, in particular, they're way ahead of the United States in solar panels and wind turbines. They are, in fact, on the cutting edge, even though some of this is still FDI, foreign domestic investment. All right, so in manufacturing, just talking about where I want to go through what is the economic sphere to talk a little bit about the relationship between the United States and China in that economic dimension. And then I'll try to go into the geopolitical and military dimension where I think the conflict is most clear and most frightening in some ways. So in manufacturing, China has essentially displaced the United States in so many areas, including becoming now the #1 producer of steel in the world. It's the exporter of 4/5 of all textile products in the world and 2/3 of the world's copy machines, DVD players, and microwave ovens. That's a significant leap into economic emergence into economic hegemony. Now, I will, as an aside, there is a debate, particularly among world systems research people, about whether or not China will become the next hegemonic power. And I want to reserve that discussion until a little bit later. And of course, here I think we have to understand that what's going on between the United States and China is an interesting dance at some levels because it's really a symbiotic relationship. In other words, the Chinese hold 40% of U.S. Treasury. Right? Although they're trying to begin to sell that off, they chastised the United States recently about what an economic mess we are and trying to get the deficit in order, even as the United States comes back and says, well, you're manipulating the yuan, and so there's going to be some effort to try to wrap knuckles on both ways. But this symbiotic relationship means that the Chinese have invested so much money in terms of U.S. treasuries, and helping to underwrite some of the U.S. foreign wars, even at the same time, and this is sort of one of those amazing ironies, right? China negotiates a contract with the Afghan government to take as much copper and other minerals that they can find out of Afghanistan, even while the United States is sort of plowed under so much of its resources and treasure in prosecuting this war in China. But of course, the other thing is the United States is the #1 importer of Chinese goods. So you've got this, as I said, a kind of symbiotic relationship. So it's China is obviously very interested in trying to diversify its partnerships and expand those partnerships. And in fact, not just with the BRIC. As you may know, the BRIC, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, has now become the BRICS. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And obviously with Iran at some level playing a junior partner and Turkey emerging as another potential regional power, what you're getting is the creation of new regional blocks and new trading blocks that would supplant what had been the dominant U.S. Hegemonic trading order. And China certainly has the manufacturing capacity to do that, but it also has critical problems with in its manufacturing. But it's those geostrategic moments of competition and conflict that I want to just emphasize a little bit. Since China is approaching, I think, about 20% of the world's energy consumption, it may very well overtake the U.S. as the largest hydrocarbon consumer in the next decade. It's already the #1 producer of greenhouse gases, but it is not on a per capita basis. We're still #1. But the Chinese are much more invested in alternative energy than the United States. And that recent brouhaha about that company, solar, yeah, it's like, that's a great sort of indication of problems here. So what you have is for both the United States and China, and certain geostrategic areas like the Caspian Basin are competing at some level to control the flow of natural gas and oil. And the Chinese have made all sorts of arrangements. Part of the argument, for example, of Pepe Escobar in the Far Eastern Review is that the war is about Pipelanistan, where the pipelines will be laid. Will they go through Pakistan, which is the preference for China, and less so now for the United States? Or will it go through India? Will it have a different flow? And this is really, these are where these geostrategic competitions, I think, are particularly significant and something that could lead to very damaging potential conflicts. And of course, one of the problems is that China, that is for the U.S. elite, governing elite, is that Washington really is not doing a very good job of placating major players in these areas. And China appears to be able to negotiate a lot better. Doesn't have to worry about draining its economy to finance overseas wars, and figuring out a way to get mineral and energy resources globally by this kind of investment in not only in areas like the Caspian Basin, but in Africa and in Iran, in the Middle East, and Latin America. So we have China just developing all of these multi-billion-dollar trade and investment agreements with Venezuela, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Peru, Bolivia, securing access to energy, mineral, and agricultural resources, and the United States are lagging far behind, for example, in Latin America, with the exception of Colombia, where the U.S. manages to pump in a lot of money to the military and to the paramilitary that have been very harmful towards union organizing. So we get this kind of disparity, I think, that you can see. So the U.S., unlike the established colonial powers and empires of the past, cannot really deny access, China's access to strategic raw materials, as maybe was the case when you could do that with Japan. Living in a post-colonial world, the vast majority of regimes will trade and invest with whoever pays the price. This is Jim Petrus's analysis of why the decline and what this says about the geostrategic and economic interests. But what I now, and the last point I want to most focus on, and then turn it open to questions and comments, is the military conflict. Again, the U.S. spends an inordinate amount of money, one half of what the world spends on military weaponry. But the key conflict, I think, is very much in the South China Sea. Concern about trading lanes and naval passage. And of course, if you go back to World War I, one of the things that was key to the struggle between between Germany and England was over naval routes and who would control what kinds of passages. So there are historic, and I don't know enough about England and Germany to say anything about the degree to which England was invested in German industry. That would be sort of an interesting issue. Maybe other people would know a little bit more about that. Because then the argument would be, well, if you're so heavily invested as the United States and China are in one's economy, you can really go to, you wouldn't really have a war. Well, I just don't think that follows, unfortunately. I think, unfortunately, there is an addiction to war. I hate to reduce it to a kind of psychopathology, but in terms of this declining empire. And the United States insists on conducting naval exercises in the South China Sea. And to, although pull back as the Obama administration has recently done, in giving additional military equipment to Taiwan and updating their jets. There is a strong lobby, nonetheless, that was critical of Obama for cutting back on Taiwanese military aid. And that strong lobby does represent the more hawkish wing of that declining empire. So we see that for one recent comment in the Chinese, one Chinese newspaper said the United States-China wrestling match over the South China Sea has raised the stakes in deciding who the real future ruler of the planet will be. Maybe you just read it there from that particular newspaper. But there clearly are, I don't have the citations, but it was in the Huffington Post. It was quoted by Alfred McCoy, who wrote this article, which I sort of depend upon too, The Decline and Fall of the American Empire, 4 Scenarios for the End of the American Century by 2025. And of course it's that vision of the American century too, which is part of that, the ideological element of the empire, the vision first articulated in 1941 by Henry Luce, the owner of Time Life magazine, that the United States was the inheritor of Western progress and could do what it wanted to in the rest of the world. And everybody sort of says, well, that American century lasted less than a century. It's on its way out, that notion of establishing that kind of global leadership, even though every major player from both the Democratic and Republican parties pays homage to the idea that the United States is still the global leader. The United States still has to be the sheriff. If you read Barack Obama's Audacity of Hope, he talks about it that way too. So it's not like we have a governing class that is prepared to deal with this decline. Admiral Mike Mullen, who just stepped down, was talking about the need to maintain and expand the U.S. presence in the Pacific, Obama's National Security Advisor, Tom Donilon, is sort of talking about the unchecked influence of China in the region. And China, of course, sees this as its region that it should have a little bit of latitude and a little piece of hegemony. But the U.S. wedded to this larger image that has deep roots in our political culture and has very strong material interests in terms of the geopolitics of the military-industrial complex suggests that there's some real problem here. Giovanni Arrighi's take on this is interesting, and I just want to quote a little passage from Arrighi before completing this discussion. Arrighi, and this comes from Adam Smith in Beijing. I know there's some disagreements we have about this, but he argues, and it appears to be the Chinese posture at this point, would it not be in China's best interest, one, to let the U.S. exhaust itself militarily and financially in an endless war on terror? And again, we should, the Obama administration is trying to do this on the cheap. It's using drones, but nonetheless it's expanded special operations forces in at least 70 countries of the world. So it's not as if it's backed off from the, it just calls it the long war now. That's the Pentagon's reference to it. Two, to enrich itself by supplying goods and credits to an increasingly incoherent U.S. superpower. And three, use its expanding national market of wealth to win over allies in the creation of a new world order centered on China, but not necessarily dominated militarily by China. And here's the way in which he tries to navigate through that distinction of empire and hegemony and what that ultimately means. As I said, I don't see anybody in U.S. Governing classes prepared to eschew U.S. global leadership and to back off from what potentially are real damaging conflicts. And the Pentagon is committed to continuing to engage and expand its Pacific involvement, expanding the basic quorum, etc. To go back to the dean of the declinists, Paul Kennedy, in his study of the growing antagonism of England and Germany leading up to World War I, it was those geopolitical conflicts and military imperatives that really played the significant, if not the sole, determining role in the eventual clash between Germany and England. And I would argue that we have that same sort of, we have a similar configuration with obviously different temporal and cultural differences. I think there's enough of a popular resentment that could be marshaled also around China, would come both from a kind of popular right-wing populism, but we see this in particular blaming China for the loss of our manufacturing base and what could be mobilized around that. There was the whole effort to demonize Wen Ho Lee, you might remember as another one of the atomic spies, the Chinese version of the Rosenbergs, I guess, going back to the construction of a kind of a Cold War with the Chinese. There are some who suggest that the U.S., out of its recognition of the detrimental domestic and foreign aspects of imperial overstretch, will accommodate itself to a multipolar world. I don't see that happen. I don't see, given the trajectory, how that will happen, even though I agree with De La Hero and others who point to the emergence of a multipolar world, the post-American world, although I don't like the way Fareed Zakaria configures it. But that's part of my argument in a nutshell, that we are moving in that multipolar world, that the empire is in decline, that we are at some dangerous flashpoints with the rising power of China. And we need to make sure that we participate in quickly deconstructing our military-industrial complex and to changing our governing, to changing the governing class so that we have a future. Thank you. Open to questions, comments, criticism. Alex?
A good friend of mine, Gopal Balakrishnan at UC Santa Cruz, always says whenever a world systems theorist predicts the future, bet against that country. I mean, if you look at the first volume of Giovanni Arrighi's Long 20th Century, of course the last chapter is Japan.
Right.
And
which was Kennedy's.
Right.
Kennedy too.
Yeah, that's what everyone of course predicted. And then of course he has to then write a book about China to kind of make up for that later.
Right.
I'm a real China skeptic on this idea that it could at all fill this role as some sort of hegemon within the capitalist system. And of course, even Arrighi doesn't quite make that argument.
Right.
I mean, and Wallerstein argues very clearly against
Right.
it. And Arrighi says China's doing something else, but it's pretty unclear what Arrighi's trying to argue. But I mean, there's a whole number of reasons why I think China, will not be able to play this role. One is just demographics. It's one-child policy means that it's going to have a very sudden curve of aging, and a gender balance. That's
That would argue the other way. When you have too many males, that always is a crisis, and some people have suggested that's also what leads a country more to taking a much more aggressive military posture.
It could maybe lead it to be more aggressive, but the fact is that they have a very large kind of working class population at the moment, but in a couple of decades they will have a tiny working class population in relation to their elderly population, meaning that cheap wages are going to be a much shorter time span of cheap wages in China than was happening in other places that kind of moved into that kind of pre-productive country around the world. Debt, I mean, the government debt is enormous. We don't know how big it is.
Right.
Most of it happens at the local level, and it shot up over the last couple of years. They were able to do a very huge stimulus, much bigger than was even said, during this last crisis of 2008, whatever you want to periodize it. But they can't do it again. If the world went into recession again, say in this starting next year or something, or pretty soon, they could not do that kind of stimulus again, and they'd be in serious trouble. The estimates are that their GDP growth would drop down to about 4% or something if we went into recession.
As opposed to 9.5 or whatever.
As opposed to 10, 9.5, 11, things like that it's been at. But if it's not above 6, they can't keep up with the growth of employment at the moment, the short-term growth in employment, number of people looking for jobs. It would be very devastating to China. It's tied to the U.S. A lot of people say, well, they have all that surplus from sending all this goods to sell at Walmart. They can't use that surplus. It's impossible to use that surplus in China. They have to buy the U.S. treasuries, otherwise it just turns into inflation. Of course, in China, you can't get out of that situation. It has to be plowed back into the United States. Then it's you mentioned some of this. Much of its economy is based on basically what you could call primitive accumulation, where you have you devastate the environment and you don't kind of reproduce a good environment, which you can use to continue production. You just use it up very fast, pollute the rivers. Don't worry about environmental issues at all. It's also true in terms of reproduction costs of the low-wage sector in China, mostly peasants. You don't pay for reproduction costs of that low-wage labor in China because when your children are young and when you're elderly, you go back to the countryside and you have to grow your own food. There's no retirement for those people. You don't have to take care of all the costs of education, housing, all those things for the pre-worker age and the post-retirement age. So reproduction costs again are not being paid either for the environment or for the working class. There's many reasons that I think China just actually cannot head towards this kind of position as a sort of capitalist hegemon.
Yeah.
But again, you didn't really use the word capitalist much when you said hegemon, so I'm not exactly sure if you really are only focusing on military or not.
Thank you for the corrective, and I should have underscored the fact that I am much less certain about the idea of China as a hegemon. I'm much more convinced by what little I've read that it certainly plays a role as a major regional power, and that it's establishing extensive new kinds of trading networks globally, which are outside of the trading networks that the U.S. Promoted over a long period of time. So my again, the emphasis that I tried to place in the presentation was on the nature of the declining U.S. hegemony, not necessarily that China was a rising hegemon as much as a rising power, and what that ultimately means. I don't, again, I think all the points you raise are things that I also understand, but only dimly and vaguely about China. So, thank you for.
So in a way, you could say that this shows that maybe world systems theory is also losing its relevance now. So,
I should have said at the very beginning that I'm a modified world systems theorist. That is, I have problems with the way that they talk about core and periphery, and that it tends to then privilege the core theoretically. And so there are lots of little pieces about the Wallerstein, Arrighi, Chase-Dunn approach that I'm still, I'm not thoroughly convinced about. But I do think as an overall framework within which we better understand the rise and fall of empires in the West in the 15th century onwards, it still gives us a sharp tool to get at those moments of rise and those moments of fall. Yeah, Jen.
I wonder, I guess related to that, and related to the question I had, then maybe is the nature of empire changing, and maybe that's what makes it difficult to use world systems theory to explain this moment.
Yeah.
Because what's striking to me in thinking about the way that we talk about the decline of the United States today and its role in the world is how it's explicitly not imperial language. Versus the British Empire at its height and its decline was always, to the very end, talking about empire, the benevolence of empire, the justifications for empire.
Yeah.
Whenever it started to decline, it tried to justify its decline by saying, "Oh, this was part of our program all along. We built these places up, and now we're letting them transition out and recolonizing and all these things." But you don't hear this in the American discourse, the public discourse, not from politicians, not from. So there's this recognition that the U.S. has to be or is a global leader, global police, all those things.
Yeah.
But that's different, it seems to me, than openly accepting and recognizing its role as empire, as an imperial power, which really hasn't been recognized. I don't think. I mean, I know very little about U.S. history, but since Teddy Roosevelt, I would imagine you're sort of somewhere around there. But at least in those World War moments, that language shifted away, and it went more toward this kind of global policing. So I wonder if this is what implication that might have.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's always been a thread, and William Evelyn Williams talks about this too. There's always been a thread in the imperial policies of the U.S. which utilizes anti-imperialist rhetoric and discourse, and that's sort of like this innocent sensibility. And the United States is coming to bring liberation, coming to bring freedom, coming to bring democracy, except to places like Honduras and a variety of places that are clearly are Yemen or Bahrain or so you have what is clearly a contradictory moment of the imperial policies which are in a sense rubbing against the anti-imperialist rhetoric, and that often creates the sense of incoherence that people talk about, and Michael Mann and a variety of other people talk about the incoherence of the empire. But I think in some of the broad strokes, there have been changes over time, just given the nature of capital and what's transformed over time. I wouldn't go as far as Hart and Negri to say, we're now in this deterritorialized environment where there's no longer nation-centric rule, and that's, I just don't, we still have a foothold in that, as well as there being these neoliberal moments that are post-national. But, so your point is well taken. It's not as if there isn't that anti-imperialist rhetoric. It's not as if the United States has tried to engage in its imperial policies with a different face, even though often the reality, and one adds up the number of deaths in the post-World War II period from U.S. policies, one would have to say that it's certainly exceeded, I would have to say it's exceeded what we understand of other empires.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of parallels. I mean, I just wonder if there's any significance to the fact that I'm not sure that political leaders over the last 50 years have even considered the types of policies that they've engaged in as imperial policies. So, like, not necessarily just like it's a PR move, but rather, I don't know if, like, internally.
Well, internally, it's clear that Teddy Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge and the emergence on, this was really the bully moment, right? Or the heavy macho appearance on the world stage, and we're going to take up the white man's burden, and and all that kind of racial coding for what went on. So it very much was a kind of imperial moment. But it settled into and was transformed in a sense to the good neighbor policy of FDR and the Alliance for Progress under John Kennedy. But the Alliance for Progress was also an enormous counterinsurgency program. So you had the rhetoric of helping people realize their national aspirations, and at the same time CIA funding for police forces and the military that were stamping out the possibilities for real emancipation. So there's that combination.
I wonder, just kind of picking up on this, the British example is really interesting because in acknowledging empire, they also could establish an exit strategy
That's
from
right.
empire.
That's
and,
right.
And taking your question, it kind of supports your thesis that we're in a dangerous position because we don't have any.
Yeah, what is the exit strategy? Exactly.
Yeah.
Well,
Exactly.
and then there's the French who exited empire but haven't reckoned with it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's another model,
Yeah.
which is like the cultural empire.
Yeah, exactly.
And that seems like that, given U.S. dominance and global popular culture, I mean, that seems like that might be a straw to hang on to as far as global hegemony, even while economic and military dominance perhaps declines. So
Yeah, yeah.
I wonder.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, obviously, and I try to argue out the issue of cultural imperialism in my book because it's a really contested idea. But it's clear that to some extent you can say, well, Hollywood has been supplanted by Bollywood.
Really?
There are the ways in which even U.S. Culture, like McDonald's and et cetera, gets
I mean,
mediated.
if you go to Europe, that is not. I've never been around the world, but at least in Europe, I don't think you can. Paris is a film capital. I don't think you can see a Bollywood film in Paris.
Yeah, well, that may be true, but in the rest of the globe, it's a major exporter, a major producer, produces more films than Hollywood does. But that doesn't suggest that the Bollywood necessarily has supplanted Hollywood in terms of its pervasive hegemony in the reshowing of films. And being able to watch, as I did when I was in Nicaragua in 1984, The Three Stooges. I don't think they're showing Bollywood in Daniel Ortega's Nicaragua, even though they might figure out there might be some other films that are not Three Stooges anymore that you can do. But no, I mean those are all interesting points about these holding on to some semblance of the mission, the civilizing mission. Again, I was trying to go for the French, but I was going to botch it, so I had to translate quickly. And then so what is the exit strategy? some people say, well, it's this, Obama's going to figure out a way of leading from behind. It's like, I'm not sure what that says about what's going on.
Although in his defense, he did not say that.
That's right. That's what's been imposed upon, to try to create an Obama doctrine of what is an incoherent policy. So, yeah.
Somebody's good.
Yeah. Sean?
Yeah, I like your the economist view from China thing, and it's interesting because a lot of publications on China have precisely sort of some variation of your title, the decline of the U.S. and the rise of China, and it's very interesting how that functions in the U.S. imaginary. So I mean, what is it? I'm interested, like, what is it doing? Because if we kind of take the point of view that places like China or India are very, sort of like the last reserves for capitalism. And if this capitalism, the battle between sort of capitalist hegemonic nations is sort of happening and it's going to blow itself out, either it's going to clear out the planet or whatever it's going to do. But in some ways it seems like that this notion of the rise of China and the decline of the U.S. Holds out the long view for capitalism, and also like the capitalist nation. And also this idea that if the U.S. is declining, then who is going to take the mantle? And it's very interesting. So, like, do you have a kind of sense of how to mine this kind of discourse, or what's the work it does?
Yeah, there's a couple of really interesting layers to that. The first one of it, and Alex, I think maybe you and I can agree on this, which is that how China's capitalism gets played out is certainly not part of what one would think of in the traditional capitalist hegemony. So there's that. In the U.S. imaginary, we've got to go back then, let's go back to the 19th century, to what was clearly an anti-Chinese policy. And that anti-Chinese policy was driven a lot by white workers, right? Who were very much opposed to the idea of cheap Chinese labor being brought in. And you still have that element within the labor movement in the United States today that China is the prime responsible power for the loss of manufacturing in the United States. So you've got, as I said, a kind of populist discourse and that kind of political imaginary, a sense that the Chinese, and this is overlaid with racist terms clearly, that the Chinese have slyly stolen or will undercut U.S. labor and U.S. production. And that can be mined by right-wing demagogues, although I think that, as you see, neoliberals have too much at stake to use that. So even, I guess, John Boehner was critical of, as somebody trying to manage some element of neoliberalism within the Republican Party. Those are just off the top of my head some responses to needs much more thought. More questions, comments?
Just a real quick one. I guess we look. I think historians love it when another historian puts him or herself up to predict the future, because we're always caution against that. And one thing I was wondering about is, during the 70s and the loss of Vietnam, this term came out that I guess maybe later, the Vietnam effect, the crisis in U.S. confidence, and sort of, especially military confidence, led to at least a brief period of still war, but not as much war.
Right.
Do you think something similar could happen, say, in the next couple of decades because of Iraq and Afghanistan? And as possible evidence for this, you might be the Republican candidates for president right now who, at least on the military front, seem to be left of Obama in some respects. People like Ron kind of have these amazing statements that we should bring everybody home.
Yeah, I think part of that is their rhetoric to placate part of part of what is the Pat Buchanan base. Because, you know, Buchanan's point has always been that, yeah, you know, that we should be a republic and not an empire, and so we need to pull back and close our borders because we don't want all those swarthy people coming in. You know? I mean, this is the racist component of that right wing in the Republican Party. But clearly, the Pentagon's also thinking about, you know, how do you fight wars on the cheap, or conversely, how do you fight wars with cutting edge technology? So they're clearly, I mean, in here, I think the Pentagon is also to the left of the Republican candidates on global change and the crisis that global change might induce worldwide and how you try to manage that. But clearly, this embedded still is, while you may have to pull back from reconfigure the idea of what was called the revolution in military affairs, you know, the big thing that also Hart and Nagry used as another moment at which supposedly the U.S. has given up empire. But I think they're you know, the Pentagon is constantly trying to reconfigure how it prosecutes war and what are the most efficient ways of prosecuting war. But at the same time, I think deeply connected to that is a sense that counterinsurgency strategy in this next period will be more important than the nation-building strategy. So even though you know, the right, the Republican Party had eschewed that idea of nation-building, that's exactly what happened with George Bush in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they weren't prepared to do it on this issue now. You know, Iraq is a great ally now of Iran. And, you know, you just have exactly the wrong things out there. The Taliban's coming back. I mean, all sorts of things that, you know, completely went wrong because you know, typically, as it's sometimes said, and you've never know this better than I do, the generals are always planning the next war based upon the last one. So who knows? I mean, I don't think there is any humility in the policy, either in the Pentagon or in the, as there was in a sense after Vietnam, or in the governing class. I mean, I think that you could see that crisis in the Jimmy Carter first 2 years, where there was a real pullback and attempt at a certain kind of alignment, prepared to even acknowledge liberation struggles in Africa, for example, you know, and then the hardline turn with Brzezinski and drawing the Soviets, supporting the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, drawing the Soviets in. And even to this day, you know, Brzezinski talks about the multipolar world. Still said it was a great thing that we ended the Russian Empire by, you know, even if we've caused a little difficulty in that region of the world. So, yeah, it probably is not a good answer to a good question about. And the guy who I rely on is this guy Nick Terse. If you read any of his stuff, he really has a good bead on how the Pentagon's strategizing and what it's thinking about and how it's planning, you know, war strategies. I'm more than happy to end, and, and thank you all for